Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the GRA RIPAC discussion of education funding issues. I am Sarah Wetmore, President of the GRA and Vice President of the Civic Federation in Chicago. We are so pleased you all made it on what is a lovely spring Friday in Chicago. I want to thank Mike DiBiase of the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council for co-hosting, and Ed NC for their generosity in sponsoring the graphic recording and Dan and Gerlach's appearance here. I also want to thank all of our panelists for pulling together an informative afternoon for all of you. Finally, I want to welcome some attendees from the GRA's newest member organization, the Sycamore Institute in Tennessee. Welcome. Before we get started, I wanted to make a few logistical announcements. First, we are recording this event and we will make it available on the GRA website. So you will be able to share it with any colleagues and friends who weren't able to make it today. The Q&A of both panels will be moderated by me. Some of you sent in some questions ahead of time, so we'll get to those. And we'll also be using the chat function and the raise hand function. So I'll be mixing all those sources together, so don't be shy with those questions. Next, I want to introduce Karen Sterling. Karina's going to add her as a spotlight. All right, there she is. Karen will be providing graphic recording of the event today. As you can see, she's already in front of her canvas and ready to go. She'll be spotlighted the entire event, so you'll be able to see what she is drawing and writing, in addition to the presenter slides and their lovely faces. We will send all of you a picture of Karen's work after the event, and it will also be posted on the GRA website. You should feel free to share it on social media as well. And that reminds me that we have some hashtags for today's event. Hashtag GRA Talks Education, hashtag GRA Education Funding, hashtag GRA Education Panel, and because this is a pre-conference panel, hashtag GRA Conference 2021. Katie Broom from the Civic Federation will be doing some live tweeting. Thank you, Katie. And you will see the speakers' Twitter handles on the slides in the presentation deck in case you want to tag them. Final logistical detail, I promise. Please keep yourself muted unless you've been called on to ask a question. And if you are a Zoom pro, please feel free to zone out for the next few minutes. We want you to be able to see Karen's work, so we have a suggestion on how to set up your view on Zoom. Karina will spotlight all of the speakers and then share her screen in order to show their slides. Once she does that, you may see all of the speakers in a free floating window. You can click on the button in the right-hand corner called Swap Shared Screen and Video, and that will make the speaker videos appear in the main window, and it will create a free floating window with the slides, which you can then resize to make as big as you like, move around so you can see everything in one place. There's another option where you can click View Options at the top and select Side by Side, which will put the slides and the videos into two side-by-side panels, which you can then adjust in size by moving the slider. Make sure you have it set to gallery view so you can see Karen as well as the speakers. So choose your own adventure and maybe report back on what worked best for you. So our first panel will be discussing education funding issues in 3 states, Rhode Island, Utah, and Colorado. I'm going to introduce all 3 panelists now, and then we'll move to Q&A and then straight on to the second panel. Mike DiBiase joined RIPAC as president and CEO in January 2020. Prior to his appointment at RIPAC, Michael served for 5 years as Director of Administration for the state of Rhode Island. His prior experience includes senior positions in government relations for Fidelity Investments, as well as serving as Chief of Staff for Rhode Island Governor Lincoln Almond. Sean Teigen is Vice President and Research Director for the Utah Foundation, and also Vice President of GRA. Sean worked as a housing policy analyst with Community Action Partnership of Utah, and has worked for Utah's chapter of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials. He serves on the board of directors of several public sector, private sector, and nonprofit organizations, including as chairperson of the Salt Lake City Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board. Phyllis Resnick is one of the co-founders of the Colorado Future Center and currently serves as both executive director and chief economist, and is also a past GRA trustee. Her most recent research focuses on macro fiscal forecasting, fiscal sustainability, economic impact analysis, and the political, economic, and distributional effects of fiscal rules such as tax and expenditure limitations. Internationally in the developing world, she works as both a consultant and a volunteer with central and local governments on issues of macro fiscal forecasting, tax policy analysis, open budgets, and transparency, and fiscal decentralization. All right, so Mike's up first for us. Take it away, Mike.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel, and Sarah for her leadership and initiative in organizing this panel. And as a relative newcomer to GRA, it's really great to be at the adult table and be with all of my colleagues. I think this is a great topic. Education funding is a complex issue. It's an area where we can all learn from each other. I wanted to just kind of high level go through what's happening in Rhode Island. We could go to the next slide. So Rhode Island is the smallest state. We're not the smallest in population, but we're pretty small, 1 million people. And we have, as you can see here, 140,000 K through 12 students. We mostly have school districts that are the same as the cities and towns. So we have 39 cities and towns. So we have a few regional districts, but most of our school districts are the same as the municipalities. We have elected school committees that are responsible for overall management, but they don't have power to raise revenues. They rely on their municipalities for funding, which is a source of continuous tension. Our largest district, Providence, was taken over by the state in 2019. That's been a bit rocky, particularly during COVID. And unlike many states, we do not have a state constitutional right to education. If we could go to the next slide, just wanted to show you that Rhode Island is relatively generous in its support for K-12 education. We are 10th. This is for FY 2018 data, so you can see our friends in Utah are at the other end, and Colorado is pretty far down as well. So next slide. 10 years ago, about 10 years ago, the Rhode Island General Assembly adopted a school funding formula. We were the last state, I've been told, to adopt the funding formula. And it's not unlike what I understand as many funding formulas in other states. It's based on a core instructional amount, which is a set of itemized expenditures. We take the average of 4 states, for some reason, including our own, which I don't fully understand, but Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island. Connecticut and Massachusetts are much more affluent states than Rhode Island. We also have a 40% sort of bonus factor for low-income students. And then we have a state share based on the city or town's fiscal capacity, family income, and concentration of student poverty. On top of that, there's also categorical grants, and the state and local share follows the students. And this was intended, it was remarkable that this was actually passed during the Great Recession and pushed a lot more money toward the poorer communities and took money away over time from the more affluent communities. So we go to the next slide. The funding formula has actually worked to not only move money toward the poor districts, but actually ramp up, as you can see from this, state spending. So state spending on K-12 education has actually outpaced slightly overall expenditures. And you'll see that from the rate here. And we could go to the next slide. And what that actually did, this is from some of the reports that we've been doing. This is 2 snapshots. So you can see from 2012, which is the first year of the funding formula, 32% of K through 12 funding came from the state. And in 6 years, that we increased that to 38%, which is pretty significant swing. And the next slide, you'll see that this is a slide from one of our reports of, this is overall tax revenue, state and local. So, and you'll see that property taxes, which is the blue and the biggest, went from 45.7%. So this is overall revenues for all government in Rhode Island, local and state, went from 45.7% to 42.3%, these are pretty big numbers to move. So that's significant that we reduced our reliance on property tax. But I'll go to the next slide, you'll see that we still are much higher than the US picture on property taxes. So this is more of a New England phenomenon, by the way, that we're heavily reliant on property taxes, but we're 42.3%, even after what we've done over the last several years, but the US is 32.5. So still have a big over-reliance on property taxes. So on the next slide, you'll see that, so this is hard to read, but these are all of our cities and towns. As I told you, the formula is heavily weighted to the poorer districts, and it worked to some degree. As you can see, if you disregard the three communities to the left, which are actually have very few students, we have a pretty good distribution. The per pupil expenditures don't differ tremendously from the median, which is about 18,000 per pupil. And Providence and Central Falls, which are hard to read here, but are actually above the median. So Providence is our largest district, urban district. Central Falls is our poorest district. It's 100% funded by the state, by the way. That happened over 25 years ago. But what's troubling here is that Woonsocket, which is at the far left, and Pawtucket, which is third from the left, are still well below the median. And those are two of our poorest districts. So the funding formula has worked to some degree, leveling things out, but has not been able to bring up the poorest districts. And there's been some argument that the reason is that these communities have not put in their local money, that they've just let the state, because we don't have a requirement of increasing, the maintenance of effort is simply don't go backward. So they can freeze their local share. But if you go to the next slide, and this is, by the way, a slide that I show everyone I can find, even like complete strangers. So this is actually the per capita net tax assessment of the, so this is basically how much property wealth does a community have per citizen, per resident citizen. And you can see those communities I just talked about. Central Falls is 100% state funded, but when you talk about Woonsocket and Pawtucket, and many of our legislators are saying, well, they're not stepping up. I mean, their relative property wealth is so low compared to the rest of the state that they have some of the highest tax rates already. So this just shows you kind of the insidious impact of reliance on property taxes. And even though the state pays the greater portion of the education expenses in those communities, they still cannot keep up. I'm just going to touch on two other things before I finish. Go to the next slide. Rhode Island used to be one of the whiter states in the country, but we actually have one of the fastest growing Hispanic populations in the country right now. And you'll see here that we have some of our communities, you see here Providence, which is by far our largest school district. This is now 30% English language learners. Central Falls, almost 50%. Pawtucket and Woonsocket, a couple of the communities I mentioned, are 10% or more. So this is a serious issue in our state, and the school districts are not equipped to actually teach, to have enough qualified ELL teachers to actually deliver the services that these students need. And of course, they cost more to educate in a quality way as well. And the last slide I'm going to show you is that one thing that the funding formula didn't address was outcomes and accountability and actually student proficiency. And despite Rhode Island's generous investment in K-12 education, our outcomes are at best average and significantly lag Massachusetts and Connecticut. Now, Massachusetts is the best in the country, so that's a kind of a tough act to follow. And Connecticut is by far the biggest spender on K-12 education. But these outcomes are particularly concerning for ELL students, for students in urban schools. You don't see that on this chart, but we have middling scores in general, but we have very low proficiency levels in some of our urban schools. So this is a pretty serious issue for Rhode Island. So I hope I didn't take up too much time, but I appreciate being able to share that information with you.
All right, thank you, Mike. And next we're going to go on to Sean.
Hey, thanks so much. So, there are some similarities with Rhode Island. Utah and Rhode Island have some similarities. There are actually a lot of differences. Like, we're much more reliant, I think, on the state income tax. But today I'm going to be talking a little bit about per pupil spending and efforts. Let's see, my slides are going automatically and hopefully everything is going to be fine. So today I'm going to be talking about per pupil spending and education funding efforts. There we go. Looks like it's all right now.
Well, I'll tell you that I went to your doctor.
After that, I'll be talking a little bit about funding for students at risk of poor academic outcomes. And then lastly, I'll be talking about some 2021 legislative efforts. And so there's two ways to think about education finance. Of course, there's per pupil spending. That I think is worthwhile in some ways. The other way to think about it is per $1,000 in personal income. We like to talk about that a little bit in Utah because it tells a bit more of the story. So in terms of education spending in Utah, we are last in the nation, as Michael showed, in terms of per pupil spending. And we've been last in the nation for so long. But the story gets a little bit more exciting when you talk about how hard we're trying. And you've seen that our education funding effort has decreased, this per $1,000 per personal income. If you look back into the mid-90s, we actually reached a high of 7th in the nation in terms of that education funding effort. In 2018 or 2019, we're actually all the way down into the low 30s. We're 38th in terms of funding. In terms of that issue, the decline comes from cuts and changes to income taxes. We've seen a change to the Constitution that that really has some impact. We've seen changes to property taxes. We've seen cuts to property taxes. And in fact, we just recently saw another constitutional change just very recently. So when we think about all this stuff, like let's look at that funding. Now let's look at spending. So in terms of spending, since we're last in funding, we're also, of course, in terms of our peer states, we're last in spending. And we look at these peer states as a way of saying, like, what are some demographic characteristics that we have in common with these folks? But when you look at that peer median, we're just about half of what our peers are spending in terms of education per pupil. But our outcomes actually aren't that bad. However, when you look at certain portions of our population, we're actually we could be doing a little bit better. And that's the idea of like looking at students at risk of poor outcomes. And so when you can think about students with disabilities, with certain disabilities, but we also want to talk about, and I'm talking about mostly here, is English language learners and lower income kids, and how do we give them the supports they need to succeed at school. And the reason why you want to give them some supports is because they're at risk of having poor academic outcomes, and they often have poor academic outcomes. So in terms of Utah, our federal portion of our low-income students' additional education funding is a lot more than the state is adding in terms of enhancements. And this is for a few years back. So if it wasn't for the federal government, we would be barely spending any additional money on these populations. And in terms of average spending, so 100%, Utah's spend a little bit more, about 7% more for its lower income students. But there's some estimates that suggest, maybe we should be spending 25 to 100% more for each of these kids so that they can be doing a little bit better in terms of these outcomes. When you look at English learner students, we're also not spending a lot on them. Actually, our Utah portion is a little bit larger than the federal portion that we get. However, the reason why I say it best here is because that's an enhancement for at-risk students, and some of those funds might be used in other places like gang prevention, which is important, and for lower income populations, and not being directed specifically at these English learner populations. So there's not a lot of extra spending for lower income students or English learners. This is per pupil, $470 for a lower income kid, 226 for an English learner. That's a small increase in terms of overall percentage. However, we have seen that this year we've got some new legislation that's looking to replace that enhancement for these so-called at-risk students with a percentage that adds on to the weighted pupil unit. So you get this percentage that looks like maybe it's an increase in terms of the state proportion. However, the weighted pupil unit is only about half of the overall spending. So it's closer to 2.5% additional state money for lower income students and 1.2.5 for English learner students. There's a big caveat here in that this is the first year that this money is being added on. The legislature, as part of this legislation, is looking at what we need, what we should be adding on for these students. And they can go up, and they're going to be doing that over the next year. They can increase under this legislation to an additional 15% for lower income students and additional 5% for English learners. And, you know, if there's some crossover there, which there often is, you're going to see some benefits there possibly for those at-risk students. So our funding efforts declining. We've had a lot of things that have eroded funding over time, and we're certainly coming short in terms of giving those kids a leg up in terms of succeeding in school. But there might be a little bit of a glimmer of hope on the horizon in that we've got some new legislation that might remedy that. So thanks.
All right, thank you, Sean. Phyllis, you're up next.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's fun to see lots of familiar and new faces. I feel like we've been the poster child forever with the kind of most convoluted and complicated tax structure, but what I'm going to share today is a big change we've made. So next slide. Our story really begins back all the way in 1982 when the voters in Colorado put into our Constitution a series of property tax reforms. And the most well-known of them, and I think I've probably talked about them with this group before, is something called the Gallagher Amendment, which was a mechanism to control residential property taxes. When you talk to the folks here about why that was put into the law at the 11th hour, my friends who were back in the legislature then said it was to avoid getting, taken apart by a pitchfork. And so the question is, what did the Gallagher Amendment do and what's new? So next slide. The Gallagher Amendment essentially was this mechanism that said that the total property tax base statewide associated with residential values could not be more than 45% of the pie. So if you have a situation where residential values are growing faster than non-residential values, you needed to do something to keep that property tax base in this 45-55 split. And the mechanism to do that was something that we called the residential assessment rate. So if residential values were growing faster than non-residential values, we would apply this residential assessment rate to the residential values, which essentially would limit the share of those residential values that were subject to the property tax. And through that mechanism, we were able to ensure, and we constitutionally had to make sure, that residential values never exceeded 45% of the total tax base. Well, if you think about Colorado, from 1982 until today, we have had outsized growth in residential values in the state. So on the next slide, I show you what has happened to that residential assessment rate. So again, this is the share of residential property value that is subject to the property tax. So in 1983, if you had a $100,000 valued home, you would multiply that by 30% and your property taxes would be applied to $30,000 worth of value. In order to stay within that 45-55 split, that rate eroded from 1983 to last year, all the way down to 7.15%. So if you had that same $100,000 home, your mill levy would be applied to a little more than $7,000 in value. So as you can imagine, what we did was we significantly limited the amount of residential property valuation that was contributing to the property tax in the funding of schools. Which goes a long way to explaining the slides that my colleagues showed before me, where we were only saved by Utah and not being the lowest per pupil funded state in the country. We had these significant limitations. And then, of course, as you've heard me talk about before, and I will not get into it, in 1990, we went, or 92, I'm forgetting the years already. We went ahead and passed, it was 92. We went ahead and passed Tabor on top of the Gallagher limitations, which distorted property tax and even more. So next slide. So what does this mean for school finance? Like most other states, we have a very similar type formula where at the very highest level, we determine per pupil funding through the General Assembly that determines the total program funding. And then the funding of that amount is shared between the local property tax and the state support, mostly through the general fund. The share that the local property tax doesn't pay for, obviously, is called the state share. If you can generate more local property tax, then you get less state share. But over those years, Gallagher was eroding, and then when Tabor was layered on top of it, was significantly eroding the productivity of the local property tax. So our school funding formula, next slide, please, was becoming increasingly, like I would say to people, your majority shareholder in every single school district in this state is the state, because local support had fallen down below, I think, 30%. This graphic starts at 93, 94 as a comparison to the current values. And that's because that's the first after Tabor year. When Tabor came in, it had an additional degrading effect on the local property tax. If I could have found the data at 11 o'clock at night 2 nights ago for 82, 83, that share would have been more like 2/3 local share, 1/3 state share. So from the time Gallagher passed, we layered Tabor on top. And then we got to essentially this November, the state share had gone from essentially 1/3 of the full funding for schools to almost 2/3, which of course was squeezing out expenditures at the state level for almost everything else, particularly higher ed. So there's been a movement afoot in Colorado for many, many years to try and undo some of these limitations. And to my absolute amazement, in November, the voters, next slide, actually voted to essentially give themselves a property tax increase, which we never in a million years thought would happen. So what happened at the ballot in November is we took all that Gallagher language out of our Constitution and we affixed the residential assessment rate. I think I have it in the next slide. At that 7.15%, where it was sitting at the time that ballot measure passed. Had Gallagher, or had that amendment to repeal Gallagher failed, it's very likely that the residential assessment rate would have fallen to about somewhere between 5.9 and 6.1% by my models. So we would have had this very significant decline had this measure not passed. We've now taken that residential assessment rate and we have given the legislature the authority to set it with, I believe, a ceiling at 7.15% because it is still governed by Tabor. So they can't increase it, but they can decrease it. Right now, for this tax year, they've left it at that 7.15%. And so what does that mean? That means that for all of us who are getting our property tax valuation notices now with increases in the value of our properties, anywhere between 5 and 15% over the last 2 years, all else equal, our property taxes locally are going to go up by that same percentage because we don't have this offsetting decline in the residential rate anymore mandated by the Constitution, which is going to put presumably a lot more local funding into the property tax. And then I will end with a very quick stay tuned to see what happens. Does the legislature decide to take that and continue to provide state share and increase our support of K-12, or do they essentially keep the total program very close to where it was, take the local property tax, say thank you very much, and take the state funds and start spending them elsewhere? That is very much an open question for us at this point. So this is a pretty seismic shift in tax law in Colorado. We had 3 major tax expenditure limitations / mandates, and we completely eliminated one of them at the November ballot. So it's going to be fun to watch, and I'll look forward to coming back and sharing with you what happened, because we don't know the end of the story yet. So anyway, thanks for inviting me to join today.
All right, thank you, Phyllis. All right, and so now we have some time for questions. I'll start out with some of the questions from the that came in beforehand, but if you can also raise your hand to ask a question, you do that by hitting the reaction button at the bottom of your screen and clicking raise hand. So Mike, in Illinois, we are in the midst of a change to a new funding formula that is supposed to have increases to the funding formula every year. However, that did not happen last year because of the pandemic, and was supposed to not happen again this year, though it looks like they'll get it in. When Rhode Island was phasing in their new funding formula, were they able to increase those funding levels every year?
I have to say they did. It became sort of a holy grail to fully fund the formula. And the way it was done is that the gaining districts, I think, were phased in over 6 or 7 years, and the losing districts over a longer period, 10 years. So I was in charge of the budget during that time, and those were big increases. But there was this sort of thing that, well, we can't short the funding formula. So it actually did work, because once you start monkeying with that, then all bets are off, right? I mean, if you can limit it or give it a haircut, then you're not actually doing the funding formula anymore.
Right. All right. Thank you. All right. So a question that came in beforehand was, what is and what is not working in Utah specifically? So you can go ahead and take that however you like, Sean.
I think what is working is that even when you account for our population, and we're not that bad in terms of our educational outcomes. Michael brought up the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Utah's all right. If you group states by how much money they're putting into education, we're up there with the groups that spend a lot on education. I think what's not working is that Michael brought this up also. You look at Massachusetts, and Massachusetts was like, oh man, they kick butt on NAEP, and like they're doing so well. The difference between Utah and NAEP is really kind of a small gap compared to the gap between those students here in Utah that are doing well and those ones that aren't doing well. And it seems to me, and research suggests, that if you spend a little bit more money on those kids that aren't doing as well, you can raise those guys up. And then Michael would be looking at Utah in the future, thinking, man, how do we keep up with Utah, man? Utah's at the top of the game. But we're providing such a small additional set of funding for those students right now that ultimately it doesn't have maybe the impact that it could otherwise.
Great. All right, Phyllis. So we've got a question for you. So when does Colorado repeal Tabor?
I just answered that in the chat. So as I answered, I could read you my answer. I said, I am done predicting, because I never thought we would to increase our property taxes. But the truth of the matter is that there's people working on it. What most people don't understand, and I won't get into it because it would take our entire time today, is that Tabor has not been as detrimental as people think in the ways they think it's been detrimental. And it's been very detrimental in other ways. Some of which was addressed a little bit with the Gallagher move that we did. But the short answer is that there are some groups that are looking, they're emboldened by what happened in November, and they're looking at an assault on Tabor. My suspicion is it will not pass. And as I wrote in the chat, I think we may be headed for an all new property tax revolt, which at the end of the day could result in more strict property tax limitations than the ones we just repealed. Because when people realize the impact on their household finances, I think they're going to revolt. So, and we are an initiative state and a very easy ballot to access. So the dynamic here around all of this, I think, is going to get very interesting in the next couple of years.
All right. And then this is a question to anybody. So what's the latest in research or legal action on how much funding is actually adequate? Anybody want to take that one?
Michael.
Well, we don't have a constitutional amendment. I mean, one of the difficult things about education funding is that it doesn't guarantee success and outcomes, right? So, I mean, there's a fair amount of research out there that there's not a great correlation between money and outcomes. And I talked about the state takeover of the city of Providence, which followed a really scathing Johns Hopkins report about that school district, which made national news. The superintendent of the system said, "Don't give me more money. It's not going to help." So it's I think it's kind of a fraught issue. Although I argue that you can argue that money isn't everything, but why would the poorest districts be at the bottom, right? I mean, that seems like morally wrong to me. So it's at some point you get into an equity question there.
Yeah, and we in Utah think a lot about equalization across districts because we don't spend very much, and we don't want to get into the argument of spending more. However, we're one of the only states that hasn't been sued for the amount of money we're spending on kids, and part of that is because we do have a pretty nice, I guess, balance, and in part because the state income tax covers more than half of that education cost, and there's some equalization measure put into place for the property tax money as well.
All right, great. All right, I'm gonna give a last chance for anybody to use the raise hand function or send a question in the chat. All right, and then if you think of a question after this, we're going to, after the second panel Q&A, we're going to bring everybody back and have a round robin. And so if you've got a burning question that you think of later, you can bring it up later. All right, thank you all very much for talking with us, and we'll start bringing up the second panel. All right, so our second panel will be discussing best practices in education funding and how schools should spend the billions of dollars coming their way from the federal stimulus package. Cree Matlock works for Charter Schools USA as the State Government Affairs and Public Policy Supervisor and is also Secretary of the GRA. She previously served as Research Projects Director for the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana and will be drawing today on her extensive background in education policy and Louisiana public affairs in order to share with you all how to maximize the use of one-time federal money to advance K-12 education for years to come. Dan Gerlach joins us courtesy of EdNC and has since October 2008 served as president of the Golden Leaf Foundation. Dan has previously served as legislative budget analyst, nonprofit policy director, and senior advisor to the governor. He is currently on the boards of My Future NC Commission and the NC Early Childhood Foundation. All right, Cree, you're up first. Please proceed.
Hi, everyone. So we heard some really good stuff about education finance from various states. And I really want to use this time to have you all begin thinking outside the box as I go through my presentation. I am going to discuss billions of dollars. And as I discuss the billions of dollars that states and schools receive, let's think about how we can transform the way education looks. So I want you all to take a moment and look at this picture to the right. And everything you see in this picture now is currently in our pockets by the device we call a cell phone. They have various items in here, and all of those are now comprised into one device. Things constantly evolve and change and cannot continue to have school look the same way it did 50 and 80 years ago. So we can move to the next slide. When the pandemic hit, the federal government created an elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund, also known as ESSER, that provided a lot of one-time money to our schools. There were 3 separate allocations of these funds. Each allocation had a specific purpose, but had a lot of latitude for innovative thinking. As you can see here, the purpose of the funds is primarily to support connectivity, learning loss, and a safe environment. You can move to the next slide. Funds are allocated to each state in the same proportion as their Title I Part A grants. In March 2020, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security CARES Act included $13 billion in ESSER funds. In December 2020, an additional $54 billion for ESSER 2 was allocated through the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act. And then finally, the American Rescue Plan authorized another $122 billion for ESSER 3 in March of 2021. We can move to the next slide. Again, I can't stress to you all, this is a lot of money. on top of the traditional allocation of education finance. States and school districts have the flexibility to use their ESSER funds on any activity authorized by the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Have you had a moment to think about any innovative ways that we could see schools look differently? Is it imperative for leaders to think about how they can maximize these one-time money to ensure that education looks differently for the future? We can move to the next slide. I'm going to provide you just with a couple of examples or recommendations of how they can make things look different in a sense. Some recommendations on how to be innovative in spending the ESSER funds include technology and infrastructure, new infrastructure and upgrades to the school. Did you know the average public school building is about 45 years old in America? We have room to provide some improvements to enhance student learning, and this is the time. We also, next slide, I'm sorry. Also, the next recommendation was to improve family engagement and staff engagement. During the pandemic, a lot of families have either left the system, or it was a time where we needed to collaborate and communicate with families even more. This is a time that we can not have a broken system and create an innovative platform of how we can keep track of students, keep in touch with families, hear from them, get their needs, understand, and just sharing information. This is a time that we can use the new funds to transform what that looks like and to have a greater family engagement. Same is true for staff engagement. We have heard over and over and time again that teachers felt burnt out during the pandemic, and they had a lack of respect, and they're not having their voices heard. It's important for states and school districts and schools to use this time to regain teachers' trust and respect, and figure out a way that we can better that morale around our educators. And the next slide. Most importantly, the funds were used primarily to address learning loss. And this is an opportunity to use very innovative ways to address those things. I have seen in Louisiana, they're using, considering full year schooling in some districts, year-round schooling. They're doing additional summer school programs or additional professional development and things like that, or even assessment platforms to keep track of where students are over a period of time. So in closing, I want to leave with you all that the Secretary of Education encourages creative thinking when planning to use these funds. It's important to think creatively about new delivery models and methods and focus on investing in technology infrastructure and professional development. But one thing districts will have in common when allocating funds is to identify the most salient need brought on by the COVID crisis. Since the funding is intended to address the needs of students with disabilities, English learners, and at-risk students, the district will likely look for solutions that positively impact those populations the most. So again, I just want to leave with you guys, how can we make education look differently to make it represent what the future holds?
All right, thank you, Cree. All right, Dan, you're up.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here today. I'm no longer with the Golden Leaf Foundation. I'm a consultant, and honored to be here with representing my colleague, Annalisa Sorrells, who's on the call today. Is my mic not working? Hello?
No, it is. My apologies for the.
Let your heart not be troubled. Thanks for my booking agent for booking me last on a Friday afternoon. Appreciative of that. I want to wrap kind of around the ESSER question that Cree, I think, laid out so well. And getting to the point, Michael DiBiase, we try to train Jonathan Wilmer, your budget officer, when he left North Carolina. Any flaws that he has, we couldn't fix, and we're glad that you're having him, and hope he's doing well in Rhode Island. So Washington's here to help, and this is so, frankly, mind-boggling for a lot of us. Next slide, please. Let's think about this. In an ordinary year, state and local governments spend about $4 trillion. Education's about $1 trillion of that. The federal government spends about 22% of all revenue of that $4 trillion. About 22% comes from, so a little less under of $1 trillion comes an ordinary year from the federal government. Now, next slide, please. Now, I'll just tell you in North Carolina how it works. In North Carolina, our K-12 education system is very centralized, very state focused, more like Utah than the property tax heavy states that you heard from earlier, or like New York State, where I worked as an education analyst in the 90s. Normal year in our state, we receive about $18 billion in federal aid, and most of that is for match for our Medicaid program, as it is probably in your states as well. The locals receive about $1.9 billion in federal aid, the local governments. But in the ARP general local assistance, I'm not talking about anything from ESSER or from HERF or from the Child Care Development Block Grant or from Medicaid match. I'm just saying in the general assistance that was part of the American Rescue Plan, our state receives $5.2 billion in federal aid, and the locals receive $3.7 billion. So our cities and counties, and your cities and counties, or parishes, in the case, to due respect to my friend in Louisiana, are receiving so much new kind of general federal money, they don't know what to do with it. I think it is incumbent on all of us to go and bring them up in the way they should go and give them some handle for this, because they've got time through 2024 to spend it, but they have to spend it wisely. And I just say, just to give you a disproportionate sense of this, the federal guidance, the Treasury guidance just came out in 151 pages on an interim rule on Monday. The state governments and local governments have been waiting for that guidance, and now they have it. So now it's time to go. But just to give you a sense, this is on top of the money CRE just talked about. And of course, this money can be used for education. It can be used for other state and local sources as well. Next, please. How are states protected? Now, one thing you remember is, can anybody harken back in ancient history to May of 2020, when all of your state budget and local budget people started freaking out, to use a technical research word, because they thought, oh my God, it's those of them who lived through 2008 or 1991 or 2001 or whatever remembered, oh hell, here we go again. And in our state, we predicted that we would have maybe 15, 20% general fund hit over the next couple of years. And so everybody was freaking out. And it turns out that in our state, and perhaps in your states as well, I know it differs depending on your economy, but it's not been as bad as people thought, right? And what happened is, one of the things you should think about is, if you are not taxing online sales, go tax online sales. Because in North Carolina, the taxation of those, which we just started a few months ago, before the pandemic started, were up 47%. In other words, in a time when the base was falling off the end of the earth, the tax base was falling off the end of the earth, it was about a 50% increase in online sales. About 20% of that, maybe 10% of it is because we weren't taxing that stuff at all before. And about the rest of it is because people were shifting to vote to tax things that are goods, things that are subject to many of our state tax, sales tax bases. So to the extent your state and local governments depend on sales taxes, that helped us. And then frankly, the quick reaction, the federal government's reaction to stabilize the stock market and everything like that, helped the people who are probably at the upper end of the income scale. This is a problem that the ARP guidance lays out, but just for those of you with heavy income taxes, and progressive income taxes, that protected a lot of your base, because those people probably weren't as affected. Their wages, their non-wage income wasn't as affected during this challenging time. So state governments are not as poor as they think. So in 2008, you had federal money come in to fill in valleys, but here the valleys are not as deep. So the state governments are not in shape. You can use some of this money to backfill revenue loss, and there's a lot of research to be done on that. But remember that if your states are crying poverty, take a hard look at that, because it's probably not the case. Next, please. So here are the opportunities for public policy help. And so I used to be a kind of one of y'all run a public policy think tank is like you can know in your states, you have some of your organizations similar to yours are left of center, right of center, is a little left of center. But remember this, that one of the ways that state finances have been stabilized quietly is that the Medicaid program has got an extra boost from the federal government. In other words, the federal government pays at least 50%, up to 72% in some states of your Medicaid program. Well, the federal government during the pandemic, from its earliest times, increased that share by about between 6 and 7%. That's a boatload of money. But the problem is that is going to end when the pandemic ends. So all of a sudden, just make sure your state is preparing for that time, because all of a sudden the money truck has come, but the money truck is going away and the need will still be there. The second thing I talked about, these local governments really have no recent history. It's been since the 70s, or frankly, the 1970s, when most of y'all, I was alive then, but wasn't doing this work quite then. But in any case, they haven't got general aid, general revenue sharing. This is a new thing. So spending some time with them is important, because they, in many states, have the bulk of the responsibility, especially if there's a way, if they're fiscally dependent, if they get the money as they do in North Carolina. The school districts are not taxing authorities here, but can get some of that money, or if your cities and counties can help with that, that's important. Now, the difference between the original pot of money and this pot of money, the American Rescue Plan and the CARES Act, was that CARES Act money had to be spent in a hurry. Now, so that CARES Act had to be spent, and people thought by the end of 2020, it had to be out the door, not obligated, not encumbered, not promised, but spent, checks written. And so people were spending it in a hurry. But now with this plan, you have until December 31st, 2024. So what should you do? One is make sure your HERF money and ESSER money, which has to be spent prior to that date, gets spent first. And secondly, take your time to think about how do you sustain this over time, right? A lot of my friends in state government are freaking out. They're like, oh my God, we got all this money. I'm like, oh, let me feel sorry for you. Because they said, but Dan, it won't be sustainable. And the idea here is take the fact that the states and local governments won't hit as hard as we thought. And over time, as the federal money wanes, use the federal money first, but as it wanes, have the state money gradually come up and we can get to a higher level. So this is my audio visual. Okay, you start with the federal money here, and the state money here, and over time, balance it out when the federal money goes away. But what local government should do especially is wait to see what the federal government guidance is and what they may change based on comments back to them, and then wait on what the state does, because if you're a local government, you never go in there and step in front of the state. It's the state one that helps you, and the state will never step in front of the federal government. So that's it. But tell them to take their time and not just go and fill the potholes or do what's in front of them, but as Cree said, do something more creative. And then because it's this glide path, right? For childcare, for K-12, for higher ed, those monies are at a higher level than they're going to be. They're not recurring in nature, but they're going to be around for enough time to give you a glide path so you don't all of a sudden run out of money. It's like, when I made grants to somebody and they spent the money and they said, I said, what's your plan for sustaining this? Our plan for sustaining this is to come back to you for more money. We're like, oh no, the bank is closed. Got to think of something else to do here. So this glide path provides you with the opportunity to do that. Next, please. And so what did Treasury do? So Treasury acted Monday. So I sent in a slide. I was such a good nerd. I sent in my slides ahead of time, but then Monday I said, uh-oh, we got some time. And so here's what I think you should know, is that whatever anybody on this call thinks of the Biden administration, they are clearly of one heart and one mind in tying together the American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure bill, and the family legislation. They have a clear view of what they want government to do and how government should act. And everything is a concert of that. And we see this in the Treasury guidance, because the idea here is that, one, you're going to have to make sure that any money you use is connected to the pandemic. In other words, our state government, they were trying to, squint and maybe use some money for some stuff we wanted to get done, but it wasn't related to the pandemic. It's some economic development stuff they wanted to do, but it was not connected to the pandemic. And the federal government's not going to look kindly on that. But the other thing you should know is that when you talked about, in the first panel especially, talked about this idea of the historic inequities of ELL or low wealth districts or low wealth communities or people of color or anything else, or people living in students living in poverty, is what they say over and over again is that if you use this money, you should use it to help those communities and individuals who were disadvantaged before the pandemic, because they were the ones the pandemic hit the hardest. Whether or not you believe that or not, I do care, but I don't really care for these purposes. I'm saying what you need to do is connect it and teach and help give some guidance to your state and local governments to say is, hey, y'all, we read the guidance too. It has to be used for these populations. So this is a great opportunity for GRA work and analysis. I mean, if I were back running a think tank again, it'd be like, oh my gosh, where do I start? I mean, one of the things is if your state government is lost money is to go, look at the census kind of their definition of the census definition of general revenue and figure out how much you can use for that and everything else. So that's, next slide, please. I think I'm done. Oh, yes, I am.
All right. Thank you, Dan. All right. So the same process as before. If you want to throw a question in the chat, please do so. If you want to use the raise hand function, I'll know that you want to ask a question live. But in the meantime, clearly one of the major issues, and you both sort of hit on this, that we're facing is learning loss during the pandemic. So what are some thoughts on like how long it's going to take to ameliorate that? And is this going to be providing enough funding to help get that amelioration going?
I'm not sure who that question was directed for.
Both of you.
Sure, go ahead, Cree.
But there's no true timeline of how long this learning loss gap will remain. However, as I stressed in the presentation, it is important and imperative that the schools and the districts and the state think about how they can impact that the most and the best in an innovative way. So there is no true timeline, unfortunately.
Right, if I might, I mean, I think one of the most things I hope people take away from Cree's presentation is this idea of family engagement and staff engagement, because what has happened in our state is clearly a lot of people have left the public schools. We don't know where these kids went. And they're the kids who need to be connected to school. And the state and local governments, I didn't get into this because of time constraints, but to wrap around food assistance and rent and utility assistance and everything we can do to give some stability to that family to reconnect it. So I think Cree's point is on there. Because now the parents are growing frustrated in our state. And a lot of them have taken kids out and sent them to some schools of very high quality when they could afford it, but some schools of, I'd be a little nervous about them, but it's like schools, they don't have masks, they can do whatever the heck they think they want. But I worry about the quality of the education these kids are getting because the parents are frustrated with the teachers because a lot of these parents are essential workers. They're going to work. They're like, why are these teachers, they're just lazy and everything. And I'm not saying any of that's true, but I'm saying is getting it connected is the way to get the family to trust the schools again and get that kid back in to help mitigate that learning loss.
Are there any school districts that you know of that have the beginnings of those wraparound programs going, or maybe got some of them started during the pandemic?
So I can say that like in Louisiana, at the state level, they have really encouraged, for example, this summer most districts to implement a summer bridge program, identify those students who clearly since we've been back in have not met the mark or at that certain mark, to identify them and make sure that they are a part of that summer bridge program. Other districts I have seen, like I mentioned earlier, they are trying to increase school longer, start school earlier, end school later. So I do think those type of efforts will help mitigate some of the learning loss.
Yeah, I think the challenges in our state, I think it probably is in many of your states, is one of broadband access, right? I think that I expect our governor is going to release plans for the ARP money on Tuesday. I'm betting, I'm going to tell Annalisa, I'm putting the line at about out of $5 billion in state money, that federal aid out of that $5 billion, probably $1 billion will go towards broadband. It's that important to a state like us where the challenges are a lot in these rural areas where still about half of our population, well, now about 40% of our population resides. But I think some of those who overcame that literally connectivity were the ones that tended to do better than some of these other places where people just gave up on it.
All right. And actually, quick preview of the conference this summer. We're going to be having a panel talking about broadband and the digital divide. So put a pin in that thought, and we'll be coming back to it later this summer. So, and you talked a little bit about this, Dan, but so there's so much money coming through the door from the federal government, so much more than ARA in 2009. Is there any fear that the school districts aren't going to be able to process or spend the money in time?
The problem, well, yes, one, because they've got to spend this ESSER money that in our state is 90% of it is dictated to go to local school districts, to the LEAs. And so there's a challenge of that. There's a challenge of using it smartly, as everybody on both panels has talked about. And there's a challenge of, but luckily with this money, the thing the Treasury did with ARP is say it has to be obligated, it doesn't have to be out the door by 2024. So that gives a little bit of flexibility on that. So I think that it can be done, but it just has to be done in a thoughtful way. I mean, frankly, our General Assembly, fairly fiscally conservative, fairly politically conservative. They're like, God, we just have too damn much money. I mean, I wish I had that problem when I was a state budget officer. I would have applied that.
All right, great. I'll make oh, great. So we've got a couple questions coming in on the chat. So the last time we had a big stimulus funds for education race to the top, it did not seem to go very well. So how do we avoid that this time?
So I think some of the things that they learned from this go round is that the way that the stimulus money is allocated is through Title I. They have a set way of how they're dispersing the money. And then there are some level of requirements around how to spend that money and how to monitor that spending. So I do think there are, we won't see some of those same challenges as we saw with Race to the Top. And two, we have an opportunity again to not be so boxed in, but yet boxed in enough to do the right thing.
Great. And then, Dad, did you want to add something?
No, Race to the Top was a grant program, a competitive grant program. So people made it more complex than they did to kind of get the attention of the federal government, get the money. And I think, Michael, I would say it probably worked better in some places than others, would be the fairest way. The challenges since then, in our state, at least perhaps in your state, is that the percentage of students who are of some kind of need or some disadvantaged background, however you describe it, has increased dramatically over the past 2 decades as a share of the student body. So that kind of recognition is not thinking about what North Carolina looked like in 1995, but what it looks like in 2020. One is important.
All right, great. We have a question here also about oversight. So what do we know about the government oversight of how this money is going to be spent? What kind of reporting is going to be required? How is the government going to be monitor how it's being spent?
Well, I'll go ahead and go first on that one. And you come from a state like mine that's devastated by hurricanes. And so when the Fed sends disaster recovery money, they go, oh my God, just get all the money out, just help people. And then you go and put the money out to help people. And then all of a sudden they come down and go, well, what the hell did you spend the money like that for? You should have done this and that. And that is a fear of a lot of our people who've gone through this with the federal government, is like they're going to be scared to act. Frankly, the thing here is that there's so much money that even when the auditors come in, they're not going to be able to, do something with it. We have a pandemic recovery office set up explicitly to help make sure centralize the function. And that's something I would recommend to get some competent people, maybe cross departmentals, of the people who you know are repeated, like these are the go-to kind of people to help deal with that. So yeah, it's important. There's going to be a lot of Monday morning quarterback. Our state auditor just took a switch to, as we say this out, to our state budget office and said they didn't have enough controls. But then the General Assembly of the opposite party and the governor said, wait a minute, we want them to get the money. The whole thing is we told them to spend the money in a hurry. And now you can't go back and shoot the water. Sorry, Cree, I didn't mean to go on.
No, it's important. Go ahead, Cree. Did you have anything to add?
No, I don't have
Okay.
anything to add.
All right, then we got what might be one last question. So could a state generally fund English learner programs such as lower income students, such as with Utah's new funding mechanism that Sean had mentioned, in an effort to ameliorate learning loss, or must the funds be targeted somewhat more specifically?
Absolutely.
Yes, no doubt. The only thing you can't do, I think with Esther Cree, remind me if I'm wrong, but you have to watch, you can't supplant, right? In other words, they're going to watch to make sure, to make sure you're not going to just swap money out. And
Correct.
that's
Correct.
what they're fear of. So as long as you maintain it, but if you're saying we needed new money to pay for that, Sean, then I think you're in good shape, because they're going to look, they're saying it plays right into their view that these are the type of populations that are, you know, likely the most devastated.
All right, well, thank you both. I think what we're going to do now is we're going to bring back all of these slate of panel of speakers, and we can see if anybody has any additional questions, or if you have questions for each other. This now would be the time if you wanted to do that.
Hey, I'd just like to say that you guys, this is very informative. I hadn't really paid much attention to those ARP funds until Cree and Dan started talking today. So this has been great.
Great. All right, so I'm not seeing any hands raised, and I don't see any additional questions in the chat. So I guess a question I'd like to know is, what is your, if you could wave a wand and have some research drop out of the sky that you really, really want on this topic, what would you like to see? Like either on, you know, how to use this federal funding, or on you know, how to spend education funding, how to fund education from the state perspective. What's not out there that you'd love to see?
You know, Michael brought this up earlier. Like, there is, in terms of spending on education, there's some really smart researchers that show that, you know, the difference in funding maybe doesn't make that big of a difference. It will be interesting to see, like, with this big influx of cash, after the fact, how states spent this stuff, and if they spent it on, you know, the neediest kids. If you actually see something moving the needle, or you see those kids coming back from, you know, that learning loss faster than maybe I mean, I guess it's all important. Like, internet's going to be important for some places, but I guess it'll just be interesting to see if that big chunk of cash, which some research suggests it's those big bumps that really have positive impacts on education. It'll be interesting to see if you see any of that from this federal funding.
Yeah, I would say I'm not an educational specialist, but I think Cree actually zeroed in on a lot of the, you know, it's hard to do one-time spending, right? I mean, this is like human development. It's not programmatic, but you can see where things like summer and extra instructors and kind of a big burst of teaching and learning and actually thinking differently about it, because a lot of the ways that schools are going about their business is not working for a lot of kids. So I do think you kind of, you know, we maybe, especially to respond to the pandemic, think of this like big burst sort of things. And actually we need to start thinking that way perhaps with some of the other federal money. You know, do you do like a massive adult ed program where you get a big population through in 3 years? Because otherwise it's, infrastructure is easy, but it's hard. Human development is hard with one-time money. We don't develop people that way. So it's just harder.
Well, but if I might add, one thing that I found when I was a budget officer and a grants maker is if we can use this to kind of train superintendents and principals and our leaders and our school boards, maybe use a little bit to help them, right, and build their capacity beyond the pandemic. It's incredibly important because in a lot of our school districts, the great superintendents and serving the least of these, they get snapped up, or they tend to be in places where the boards turn over quickly, or and so I think that needs to be part of the conversation as well.
If I could, this might be a bit of a shameless pitch because it's work we're about to start, but I'd love partners on it. We've been asked by Colorado State University to take on a year-long effort. It's not related at all to the federal funds, but and Jen and I, you haven't met Jen, my partner at CFC yet, but we've started calling it our social determinants of success model, building on all the research and social determinants of health. And we're going to try and make the argument that it goes far beyond just the direct investment in education, that if kids aren't in stable housing and they're hungry and their parents are migratory because of the kind of labor, and if they don't have access to health care, I don't need to beat that forever, that the investment needs to be broader in order to see kids be successful. It's not just in schools. And that might be part of the reason why we're not getting the outcomes we want, because you can put all the money you want in the school, but if the kid, like we did a little calculation on one of the school districts around Denver, and we came up with every 7 minutes, a kid is either entering or leaving that school district because of the nature of the low-income population that lives there. Well, that's disruptive not only to the kid who's being moved around, but to all the other kids in the classroom, the teacher who's trying to teach. So if all that other social infrastructure is not there, I don't know that we are going to be successful with just school funding. So we're about to look into that much more deeply, and I would love thinking partners on that as a pitch to the group here. If anyone wants to talk those kind of issues, it would be really helpful for us.
All right, thank you, Phyllis. And we have a raised hand. Annie, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. My question is about on the capital projects side of things and infrastructure. What do you think will happen with use of federal funds on building improvements and things like that? Like, is that justified, just to throw at whatever projects are needed? Like, for example, in Cree's presentation, she mentioned that the average age of school buildings is 45 years. And I just looked up Chicago Public Schools, average age is 78 years. And 70% of the buildings were built before 1960. And there's just so many, there's just so many projects needs. So I'm curious everyone's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would say yes, but you would have, Annie, you'd have to be tied to the pandemic in some ways. Like if we're doing HVAC renovations, or we're kind of making schoolrooms more technologies ready, or we're doing something. But I think there's a lot you can do here. You just got to tie it to give a stem of a fig leaf tied to the pandemic. So I think capital is clearly on the board, clearly on here. I think you just have to be, it can't be kind of we're just building a new building for the sake of it. It has to be tied somehow to remedying the effects of the pandemic.
For example, you can make adjustments to the building, such as make it wider wider hallways, because of spacing and the way students interact. Like you can use certain pandemic elements to make changes to a school building.
All right, thank you, Annie. We have a question from Joe Adams. If the winners and losers inside local systems continue to win and lose, what difference should we expect? Inequalities within school systems are not being exposed as much as they should.
Joe, I'm interested in where you're from. See in the background.
Alabama.
Okay, well, Yeah, I think really what I would do is I would use the language of the instruction, that the Treasury Department and others are putting out, pointing to these historic inequities, is saying, we've got to show a reason how we're addressing those inequities. I mean, with your friends at Alabama Rise and places like that, Joe, that's how I would get after that. And text God love you. Well, yes, of course. So we have that issue too. I mean, our challenges are seen as rural, but our challenges really are when you go into the Charlotte-Mecklenburg School District, one of the most unequal in the United States. It's all about that. So I think drawing a line to the shadows of poverty and despair, frankly, and the skyscrapers of prosperity is tough. We haven't quite done that well here yet. But yeah, but I think there's language in there that I would use on that purpose.
Yeah, and I would add that, when I showed you the slide of per pupil expenditures, I mean, if you assume that it costs 20% or 40% more to educate a disadvantaged child or an ELL student, then what is the equity when you're looking at that if those school districts are the same? So it's, this is the face of racism in America. It is the inequality of not just the funding, but it's the level of accountability, the quality of the professionals. I mean, you can just go up and down the line, and I think we need to all kind of call that out, and we have to be successful at it too. It's not just the funding, right? But we got to really make a difference there.
All right, thank you, Joe, and thank you, everybody. Last call for questions, including questions to each other from all of the different panelists. All right, well, thank you so much to all of our speakers and to all of you for attending this discussion. So again, we're going to be posting the recording and Karen's final graphic, which you can see she's still been working on this entire time over there on your screen. You'll all receive a copy of that. And also please keep a lookout in the coming week or so. We'll be sending out the the registration for the virtual GRA conference, July 19th through the 21st. So again, many thanks to Mike DiBiase, Ed NC, thanks to Sean, whose idea this panel was, and again, to all of our speakers for sharing their insights today. And finally, I'd like to thank Karina Manzo of the Civic Federation staff for her mad organization and technical skills, and without whom this event would not have been possible. I now release you all to enjoy your weekends, and thank you.
Thanks, everybody.